Welcome to Building Grant Budgets. I'm Lisa Dodson with the Public Policy and Management Center at Wichita State University. This workshop is made possible by the Recovery Connect program, which is a Sedgwick County initiative. So we'd like to thank them for sponsoring us. Today's session will be about budgets. We're going to talk about some budget basics. What are the parts of the budget? What has to go in the budget justification, or sometimes it's called the budget notes. And then I'm going to share with you some examples of budgets so we can illustrate what we're talking about today. To begin with, I'd like to remind you of a model that you maybe have seen previously in my presentations, and this is my grant writing process. Every grant writer has their own preferred process, and this is just the way I approach writing grants. You want to start by reading the grant guidelines, which is the box in the upper left-hand corner. So once you read the grant guidelines, you'll probably have some questions about the grants. So I encourage you to call a program officer. All grants usually have a program officer, and ask any questions that you may have. Sometimes when you're reading through the grant guidelines and thinking about your project, you might want to bounce some projects off of your program officer to get a sense of whether or not this is something they would be considered as a fundable project. When you're talking to the program officer, ask them if there are copies of similar grants that you could read that have been successful. Oftentimes, some organizations will share those with you. Sometimes on grants.gov, you can find copies of narratives of programs that have won grants. Next, I write the problem statement or need statement, and we'll talk about that in another session. Then I develop the goals, objectives, and activities that are going to be part of your project. And then I work on building the budget. The budget is really a numerical version of the narrative. So once the budget is built, we can move on to writing the narrative of our grant. I follow that with the summary and the cover letter that you're expected to send with most grants. Then you can put the proposal together, and I would encourage you to ask somebody else to read it, because having a third party, especially if it's someone not in your same field of work, review the grant, they can often explain to you things that maybe you thought were clear, but they weren't so clear to the reader, or terms that you may have assumed people would understand and they don't. So take that time to do that. And then once it's been read, you submit the grant. So like I mentioned earlier, there are lots of different processes for writing grants, and every grant writer figures out what order they're going to do the sections of the grant in when they're writing it. This just happens to be the way I go about it. So what is the budget? We're going to focus on that today. And the budget is just an estimate of those resources that are required and how you're going to use those. You want to be sure that you are specific about everything that you're going to use in this program. And you want to take the time to get estimates for things that maybe you don't know or that you plan to purchase. So gathering up all of your resources and getting estimates for the prices of those is the first big step in writing a budget. Resources, when I talk about resources, these are people, staff time, facilities, transportation, supplies, all of those inputs that would go into this project. The budget is just a planning tool. So over the course of a grant that might be 2 or 3 years in length, your budgets are going to be revised. Oftentimes you're building these budgets a year ahead of when the project would actually be funded. So you are just getting estimates of expenses. What you can do is ask the program officer if you can reallocate funds to different activities during the course of the budget, but you have to always get permission to change funds. They will not increase the amount of your total grant. For example, if your grant is for $100,000, that is the most you'll be allowed to spend, but they might let you reallocate it among different activities or personnel. So when we talk about budgets and when you read about the budget in the grant guidelines, you're going to hear lots of different terms used for that. Some common ones are a line item budget, program expenses, resources needed. All of those are terms that you might see for a budget. You don't have to be a math genius to work on the budgets for grants. Don't be intimidated by it. It's simply a numerical version of what you're going to be spending on your project. So the budget is a mirror of the narrative. So whatever is listed as needed in the narrative part of your grant must also appear in your budget. It's a plan of your project. You may find that the budget forms are online or are provided in the grant guidelines. They may have a specific form they want you to use. Some foundations just ask you to develop your own budget form and enter it in the way that makes sense for your project. But anything that involves costs in the narrative, you have to have in the budget. I can't emphasize that enough. You always want to follow the grant guidelines or the grant template. You want to be sure that you are completing that correctly, so don't be shy about calling the program officer if you need to. Costs are those costs that are incurred at the time of the program. So you cannot go back and put historical costs into your grant. It has to be costs that start at the point that the grant starts. So if the grant is set to start in December of 2022, you can't spend any money of the grant before that date. So all of the costs are incurred at the time of the program. You want to list everything that you are requesting from the funder. So everything you're asking them to pay for would show up in the budget. And then any items that are donated towards your project from either partners or donors would also be listed in the budget. And so this is going to include volunteer time and consultant time. It's going to include your personnel and your fringe benefits. So all of the folks that are involved in delivering the services and all of the expenses that are incurred should be listed. And if some expenses are paid for by partners, they would be listed in a separate column than those requested from the funder. Be realistic. Don't try to pad your budget. If your budget is $130,000 and the maximum the grant will fund is $150,000, don't try to find that extra $20,000 just to put it in the grant. Reviewers recognize that and they do not appreciate it when you are unrealistic in the budget. Every grant usually requires a match, and a match is how much money you have to contribute towards the project versus what you're asking the funder to contribute. And it can be, when I say money, it can be in-kind donations or volunteer time. There's lots of things that we can use to cover match. So let's talk a little bit more about match. If you ever have questions about match or what you can use as match, be sure you call your program officer. When we say the match in the guidelines is a one-to-one match, that means for every $1 in grant funds you request, you need another $1 from a non-federal source. And that depends on the grant you're getting if you're requesting a federal grant. Budget match can be cash on hand or cash contributed by donors. It can be in-kind things like supplies or your transportation, staffing time, volunteer time. All of those can be counted as in-kind towards your match. But you always want to refer to your grant guidelines and your program officer to be sure that what you're counting as match is allowable. I can't emphasize enough the need to keep accurate documentation of anything that you use for match, particularly volunteer hours or in-kind donations. So volunteer hours can be charged only at the rate for that activity and you will need to have volunteers sign in or submit emails identifying the time that they spent on the project. So if you ever do get audited, you need to have volunteer records documenting the time that was donated. One situation I ran into when I was working was the secretary was signing in the donors, the volunteers as they came in to do their volunteer work. And that was not considered acceptable by the auditors. They wanted the actual signatures or an email from the volunteer documenting the hours they worked. So you want to double check with your program officer about how you should document that volunteer time. Volunteer time can only be charged at what the going rate is for that activity that they are doing. This is a website you can go to, Independent Sector, that will help you estimate the volunteer time in your state or area. Again, you can only charge volunteer time for what they're doing. So for example, a lawyer that is stuffing envelopes for your fundraising event can only charge time at what a clerical rate would be and not at their normal billable hourly rate. So if they normally billed $150 an hour, they could not count that as in kind towards the match at that rate. They would have to go at the rate of the clerical position. So this website will help give you an idea of what they consider the value of volunteer time. And you can also use it in your budget narrative to say that's how you got the estimate of the value. So costs. Costs, how do we get the cost of things? We need to be as close as possible when we estimate it. One, because you don't want to underestimate it because then you will be short and your organization will have to pay the difference. And you don't want to overestimate it because then it'll look like you're padding your budget. So you want to try to get estimates for costs, particularly the big ticket items. If you're renting a bus or you're renting a facility, you want to estimate those costs as closely as possible. Base it on quotes or bids. Itemize specific costs. We're going to have to list those in detail in our budget narrative. Be sure to involve senior management in project planning and cost estimates. Be sure that the folks that you work with and who are going to ultimately be responsible for your organization's success and in this grant, who are signing their name to the grant assurances, really understand what the grant involves and what the role of each person is in this grant. Include everything that you can think of that the program requires. They want to be sure that you're developing a sustainable, realistic project. And so you want to include those things that you're going to need to make the project successful. If you have partners in the project, you're going to want to show their contributions in the grant. And it might be that that's under a separate column so that they can see that those contributions are being used towards match. No supplanting is allowed, and that means those costs that have already incurred. Like I mentioned before, if you are grant is not awarded until December of 2022, you can't count any money that you spent in September or October or November. You have to wait till December 1st to charge the grant. So only those costs that happen after the grant has been officially started. Verify that any costs in your budget are the same as those discussed in the narrative. Again, that mirror that we're looking at, if you're talking about taking kids on a bus trip and then your budget doesn't show that bus trip, they're going to go, well, what happened? Are they going to do a bus trip or not? So you would have to show the bus trip and the expense for the bus trip in your narrative. Looking at the parts of a budget, almost all budgets are going to have these parts in some location or way. They're going to include your personnel costs, that involve your staff, the consultants, contractors, volunteers. So any personnel that are involved. They'll talk about non-personnel costs, or sometimes that's called direct costs, and they're expenses that are attributable to the program's operation. So there's those things that you're actually paying dollars out for. Then there's indirect costs, and they're expenses that are not directly attributable to the program, but you have to have them for operations. For example, your office, your printer paper, your cell phone, all those things might be expenses, but they may not be listed in your direct costs. You may or may not be allowed by the funder to count direct costs, so you'll have to read your guidelines to see or contact your program officer. Usually indirects are calculated as a percent of the total direct expenses, or they could be a rate that's negotiated by your organization. Lots of larger organizations like universities and hospitals have a negotiated rate with the government on what they can charge for overhead, because they do have high overhead. They have lots of buildings and lots of campus space. Part 4 is the budget summary, and that's written after the budget is completed. It usually appears before the full budget, and it's simply a summary document that tells total revenues and total expenses. And then a really important part is the budget notes. Sometimes that's called budget detail or budget justification. And that is what actually says, how did you get that number that you calculated? It gives more detail and exactly explains how you calculated the number. So we're going to go through each of those costs individually and give you some examples of them. So we're going to start out with personnel costs, and that's going to be salaries and wages, and we'll also be talking about benefits. So you're going to need to document the number of people working on the project. Usually you have to include their title of their position. Sometimes you have to include resumes of everybody that are working on the project, and then their full-time equivalent. So FTE is commonly used. It means full-time equivalent. So that is 100% of that staff person's time. And we consider FTE to be approximately 2,080 hours per year. So that's considered, if you work that many hours on a project, then you are 1 FTE or full-time. A way that it's often calculated is many times we have staff people that are only working part-time on the project because their full-time job is working for your organization, and part of their full-time job will be this project. So if that's the case, you might calculate it by taking their monthly salary times the percent they're going to spend on the project. So say I have an employee who makes $30,000, they're going to spend half their time, or 50%, on the project. Then 50% of 30,000 would be $15,000 I would charge the grant or estimate for the grant's budget as their time worked on the project. Sometimes you have folks that work an hourly rate. So you might calculate that by taking their hourly pay, $18 in this case, times the number of hours they're going to work on the project. Say they're going to work 100 hours on the project. Then I would take their $18 times 100 and get the $1,800. So those are 2 examples of how you might calculate personnel time in a budget. And we'll look at some more detailed examples of that in actual budgets in a few minutes. Personnel costs should also include fringe benefits. That's part of the salary. So you'll want to also calculate fringe benefits, and you'll do that in the same way. For example, if you have $5,000 in fringe benefits and you have somebody that's working half-time, 0.5%, then that would be $2,500 for their fringe benefits that you would charge the grant. estimate any new positions that you're creating at the market rate for your area. I've actually run into some problems where the grant was going to hire a project director for 3 years, and we seriously underestimated the amount of money we would need to pay someone for this position. And it put us in some problems with the grant. So we had to rearrange and ask for a budget adjustment in order to hire the person we wanted to hire at the actual rate. So you want to be really careful when you try to estimate these positions and not just say, oh, I think the salary would be roughly X dollars, because you might wind up finding out it costs a lot more. So always follow the guidelines. If you have any questions about this, be sure to call your program officer. Let's take a look at an example of personnel costs. In this particular budget worksheet, notice that we have 3 years. This is a 3-year grant. So you have year 1, year 2, and year 3. You have your project director who's going to work on the project. Physician's assistants also are going to work on the project. So in this example, the annual salary of the project director is $60,000. We think that director is going to work 20% of their time. So that's 0.2 FTE. So the first year is $12,000 for the project director. Notice the second year, it's bumped up to $12,360. The asterisk by the project director shows us that they are building in a 3% cost of living adjustment. So that's where that comes from. You could have this footnoted in the budget in this example. If you didn't put it there, you would be putting it in the budget notes or the budget justification. The physician's assistants earn $65,000, and we have 2 full-time positions that are going to be hired on the grant for this FTE. So that's where the 2 comes from. And that gives us $130,000 in year 1. And then each year it's adjusted by 3%. They've added up the subtotal for each year, and then they've calculated fringe benefits. They have a rate of 35% for fringe benefits, which this might be a negotiated rate for a university, for example. So they take the total salaries times 35%, and then they get the subtotal and the personnel total of $191,700 for the first year of this grant. Another example of a budget in personnel, it comes from the Victim of Crime grant, and sometimes your budgets are entered into web portals. And in this case, the state of Kansas requires that you use their budget template, and they have it online. If you notice at the top, they have all of these different categories: personnel, benefits, travel, supplies, facility, equipment, contractual, and other. And then their summary comes at the end instead of the beginning of the budget. So you would enter all of your data in that order. I wanted to give you an example of what it was for personnel. In this case, you see you have a Wichita advocate. We're asking $25,467 for the BOCA amount. And then the administrative assistant at the bottom is a match dollar amount of $7,465. So in this particular grant, we're asking the grant to pay for an advocate, a district advocate, and a statewide advocate, and that total is listed down here at $114,182. So in this case, let's drill down. You had to go to another page and say, explain how you got this Wichita advocate salary. So this is kind of a built-in budget narrative notes along with the budget. So each of those personnel positions then had their salary amount entered, and you had to put a description down here about how you calculated that. And so in this case, this person was expected to work 1,304 hours a year times the rate of $19.53 per hour. And that's how we got the 25,467. So in this case, they actually used the dollar hourly rate to calculate the time you would charge the grant for this position. Fringe benefits, and this is a good example of fringe benefits because it includes lots of things. But the fringe benefits, there's the FICA insurance that everybody was paid, unemployment insurance, health insurance, workers' compensation, retirement, and then in some instances, payroll benefit manager. So these are all things that are considered part of the benefits package. And in this particular grant, they were dividing some of the benefits were paid for by the grant and some were paid for by the organization. And the organization could count what they paid as the match dollars, the dollar match that they needed to qualify. So that's why you have some dollars in the VOCA dollar amount, the grant funded column, and some dollars in the match dollar amount. I wanted to give you one example of how they calculated a fringe benefit. So in this case, the health insurance is what we're looking at. We asked them to pay $9,370 for the health insurance, and we're contributing a match of $1,593. And the description, which is the budget notes, tell us that for the statewide advocate, it was $733.15 a month times 12 months. And that's how we got the $8,798. Then the administrative assistant, we were also using to meet match. So we took 17% of their time to come up with $1,496. So those don't add up to what we've got as the total because we have to add in dental insurance. And these are really tedious descriptions, but in some grants you have to get almost to that level. So in this case, then we had to count dental insurance. It was $47.63 a month times 12. And then when we added those together for the administrative assistant and the advocate, we get the $9,370 and $1,593. So as you read through this, they're broken out separately, but you'll notice that it tells exactly how we got those dollar amounts. Moving on now to the non-personnel costs, and in some respects, these are a little challenging because you're estimating usually, but this would include things like your contractual services, facilities, equipment, supplies, travel, transportation, professional development, printing and postage, insurance. Some grants will pay for professional memberships, and some will pay for food. Food is sometimes kind of a iffy one. It depends on if it's food for participants or food for staff, if it's food when you're traveling. Some of them are really detailed about what they allow in terms of food. So you're going to want to be sure you look at your grant guidelines. Remember that these are all the costs to run the program. And some of these costs may not be allowable. So you want to be really careful that you only ask for those things that are allowable. And usually the guidelines will clarify something that's not allowable, and you might need to call your program officer. For transportation, usually you calculate that at the federal rate. In 2022, it was 58.5 cents per mile. You want to be sure and check each year because it's usually changed annually. Let's take a look at a budget that shows us some examples of direct costs. So again, this is the budget that has year 1, year 2, and year 3. They've estimated office expenses and supplies at $1,200 for each year. They estimated travel at 4,000 miles, and at that rate, it was 0.575 cents a mile, or 57.5 cents a mile was the rate the year this budget was put together. And that gave us $2,300. Then meeting expenses, that is probably a registration expense or a hotel, but without looking at the notes, we don't know. And then a data training other was $750 times 2 people to take it, gave us $1,500. So these are common direct costs that you would see if you were putting together your budget. Let's go to our VOCA grant again and see how they handle direct costs. And remember, a lot of the things they have up here would fall into direct costs, like travel, supplies, facility, equipment, contractual. That might all be direct costs. So in this case, they put down rent, and they've charged $4,500 to the grant, and $6,750 they say they are contributing as match. So this organization was going to have to pay the rent on their facility, whether they are working on a grant project or not. So it's really often common to take into account rent in a grant and to use that for match. Now, notice how they calculated this. The annual lease was $54,000 a year, and they said 25% was for the VOCA staff. So the staff that are paid for by the VOCA grant, 25%. They actually measured the square footage of the facility and how much office space was needed for the VOCA staff, and that's where the 25% came from. So they had to actually document how many square feet the VOCA staff were going to occupy in the building. So sometimes some grants get really detailed about how they want you to calculate these dollars. So they split it in order to get some of the match that they needed because they were going to pay this rent, whether VOCA was there or not. Let's take a look at travel costs. I wanted to show you an example of travel and how it's calculated a little bit because it can be somewhat complicated. So in this situation, we're going to again use the IRS standard mileage rates that the federal government publishes. In this case, there was a committee meeting in Kansas City for this grant, and our mileage for the meeting was estimated at 240 miles. In this case, we used 50 cents. This was an older grant for 4 meetings. And so we came up with the separate years. These were separate years of a total of $960. The executive director noticed that they had to attend a meeting for that was hotel, $125 a day times 6 nights was $750. We estimated 18 meals at $15 a meal for $270, and then incidentals for $555. Our budget notes would need to specify what those incidentals actually were. Then we have travel for the executive director, 32 hours times $50 an hour is $1,600. So we're taking into account their travel time, and we're taking into account mileage. $1,650 in miles times 50 cents a mile was $825. So in this case, you might have decided to use the travel hours as donated match hours or charge all of it to the grant. In this case, it was charged to the grant. Let's look at supplies and how we deal with supplies and services. Sometimes grant budgets separate them out. Sometimes they're kind of lumped together. Sometimes services falls in other or in personnel, even if it's a consultant. But in this case, these were broken out as two separate categories. So this particular grant, they were going to do a workshop for participants. So they required registration supplies, and they estimated that at $5 a participant, and that included name badges, markers, flip charts, table tents, all of that. 75 participants at the training, so $375 for registration supplies. This particular workshop was going to be for a museum, and so they were going to work on conserving artifacts. So they needed some conservation supplies for the participants. And that were things like white cotton gloves, chemicals, acid-free paper, etc. Again, they estimated a price per person times the number of participants, $2,625. Food for the workshop participants. In this case, they would pay for food because this was for delivering services to the participants. So 2 lunches, 2 continental breakfast, snacks and beverages for 2 days, $25 each, times 75 participants, times 2 days. And that's how we got the $3,750. Looking at services, and postage was considered a service in this particular grant. Sometimes postage is considered a supply. Just depends on how they want you to categorize it. But postage for mailing brochure registrations, marketing the workshop, it's going to be $1.80 each times 300. We had to print the curriculum materials for the workshop. So we estimated that at $6 per person times the 75 participants, $450. And then printing brochures for 300 museums to advertise it, we estimated that would be $2 each times 300, or $600. So this gives you a sense of what you do with the expenses, supplies, in terms of calculating them. Non-allowed expenses oftentimes can be used to reach your match. So if there are some expenses, for example, they don't pay for any food, and you go ahead and provide this food, you might be allowed to count that towards your match dollars for running the program. Moving on to indirect costs. Indirect costs are those overhead costs. Support for indirect costs varies, so you want to look at your guidelines. It may provide a percentage of direct costs that are allowed. Federal grants will allow you 10% in indirect rate with no paperwork required. So these indirect costs are like the infrastructure, the actual building, your office, your desk, your telephone service, your internet service. All of those things have a cost to them, and you want to try to recover some of that cost from the grant that's funding the project. There's also a federal negotiated indirect cost rate, and larger organizations like hospitals or universities often have those negotiated indirect rates, and they're significantly higher usually than 10%. But for most of us, for smaller nonprofits, for governments units that don't have a negotiated rate, 10% is a safe number to be within the guidelines. You can also do a lab rate. Sometimes organizations will put together all of the expenses they have and come up with it costs us X dollars an hour to run, to be open for all of our staff, our overhead, all of that. And that is called a lab rate. And I'll show you an example of that we used at WSU. And finally, just a reminder, check the guidelines. I can't emphasize that enough. Check the guidelines. Taking a look at a grant example here for indirect costs. This is a federal grant example. And notice on the indirect cost section, they have a checkbox here. You can check that you have a current indirect cost rate that's been negotiated with a federal agency. If you do have a negotiated rate with one agency, it's accepted by other federal agencies. And it's usually it's good for up to 3 years, I believe. If you have an indirect cost proposal that's been submitted, but you're waiting to hear if it's approved, you're asked to check the second box. Most of us check the third box, that we're going to choose a rate not to exceed 10% of modified total direct costs. And we declare that we're eligible for that 10%. And then the final one, of course, is applicant chooses not to include indirect costs. So indirect costs oftentimes are used to match. If you're having to pay that, you can contribute that to your cost share or your match dollar amount. In this case, match is called cost share. So for this particular grant, we took the totals of both direct and indirect expenses here times the 10%, and we put it in cost share, and that allowed us to get $25,402 as part of our match or our cost share. Let's take a look at a lab rate. Some organizations use a lab rate for their budgets, and this is a rate that's been calculated by the finance department to say this is what it costs you to run per hour, basically. And in this case, we took the director was going to work 100 hours on this project, and the lab rate was $141 an hour. So the director charge was $14,100 to the grant. And then all of these other positions were adjusted. The research and program evaluation manager at $141 a rate. Then the graduate assistant, we used their actual hourly rate of $22 an hour because they're part-time student help. And they worked 350 hours on this project for $7,700. And then the communications coordinator was a staff person, and they received the $141 rate. When we came down to fringe benefits, we had to put down the fringe benefit rate, but then we noted fringe benefits aren't included in the lab rate. So this was the rate used to calculate a professor's fringe and a staff's fringe, but it was included in the lab rate, so we didn't have any dollars that we charged it. It was a combined rate. So not every grant can you do this in, but if you are allowed to do it, it simplifies your budget narrative greatly. So moving on now to the budget summary part of a grant, this is going to usually appear at the beginning or end of the detailed budget forms. Just depends on how they want you to do it. It's going to summarize your revenues and your resources and all of your expenses, including your cash and in-kind expenses. So let's take a look at what a budget summary looks like. So this is our 3-year grant again. And you can see that our personnel totals are listed, our direct costs are listed. In this particular case, they broke out purchase services, which would also be direct costs in some budgets. The indirect rate of 25%. So that's your overhead rate that was a negotiated rate is added in there. Then you get a total, and then you get the total grand project expense. So this is an example of a budget summary. We've talked about costs so far throughout the project, throughout the proposal. This slide is really talking about program revenues. So oftentimes when you are doing something, particularly if it's a program that is contains workshops or some kind of fees for services. Say you're doing a workshop and you're doing a nutrition workshop for low-income folks, and you find out that they don't show up if you offer it free. So you decide, we'll charge $10. That'll make it seem more valuable, and that'll make people be committed because they've got some money in the game. You need to find out whether that $10 you collect per person can be used for operations of your organization, or whether it has to go back into the program. In other words, it has to be reinvested in the program that you're providing. So grants rarely cover all program costs. And so you need to understand your reporting requirements for earned revenue. That's oftentimes a difficult piece to navigate without talking to your program manager. Those reinvestment requirements may impact how much money you can pull out of the grant, and always call the program officer if you have any doubts. So I worked with one grant that we did workshops, we charged participants for it. We assumed that the dollars that the participants paid could be used to pay the phone bill and the rent and all of that. Found out it couldn't be. It had to go back directly into the program. And so we had to reduce the amount of money that we charged the grant based on the amount of money the program earned. So you want to be sure you understand clearly how to document and how to account for program revenues when you've received a grant. So yay, you wrote a successful budget and your grant is now awarded. What do you do next? Well, when you get a grant, especially if it's a federal grant, there will be requirements called grant assurances. And those grant assurances are like a contract. They'll have several pages to them and they'll detail everything. For example, what logo do you need to put on your marketing materials or your announcement about your project? How do you give credit to the funder? So there will be lots of pieces of information in those grant assurances that will tell you how you operate with the grant. Smaller foundation grants, sometimes there's not much of anything. They ask you to just fill out an online web report about what you did. So it's very detailed. Between a federal grant and a foundation grant may be much more easy to comply with documentation. Remember that when you seek a grant, look at how much documentation is required, because you may have to commit quite a bit of staff time to tracking the grant's activities. So don't underestimate that, and be sure to include that as part of your match or request funding for someone to be a grant administrator. You want to create a culture of documentation in your organization. Your entire team should review the grant assurances, and you should create a framework in your organization that supports this culture of documentation. For example, if staff are on the grant, there needs to be a way on their time card that you mark and differentiate what was work on other projects versus what was hours worked on this project. You need to have proof of any transactions, those receipts. If you purchase something, you have to have the receipts. If you buy gas to cover the cost of a trip, you have to provide those receipts. Volunteer sign-in sheets. Volunteers need to personally sign in or send you an email, and I've mentioned this previously, because it's very important to collect accurate records on volunteer hours. If you're audited, you're going to need that documentation. Track your donor contributions. You may get cash and in-kind contributions. You want to use donor agreements for larger contributions and make sure you've documented all of that. If you have partners on a grant, you want to get memorandums of understanding with those partners so that they know what their role is and what they're asked to do. If you're giving sub-grants, some grants you say, we're going to give out sub-grants to other entities for providing certain services to this project. You need to document that and track it with an MOU. Monitor compliance. Don't just think that all of your staff and all of your partners are going to be keeping the records that they need to keep. You're going to need to set up some framework in your organization where you periodically check to see that all the documentation is coming in. And remember, if you're going to change anything in that budget or do anything different, you need to contact the program officer. They oftentimes will approve the change, but they want you to let them know. So you don't just change it because you've decided that's what you need to do. You need to contact the program officer. So now I want to share with you an actual grant budget. Thanks to the Kansas African American Museum, they're allowing us to use a grant that they submitted, a federal grant that was awarded to build the Kansas African American History Trail. And this is a partnership of several museums across the state of Kansas that feature African American history. And the grant was to build this history trail, to pull it together and organize partners. So it had several partners and was kind of a complicated grant to write and to administer. So we're going to take a deeper dive into that. Bear with me just a minute while I change my screen here. Let's see. So hopefully you are seeing the IMLS budget form. IMLS is the Institute for Museum and Library Services with the federal government. They get certain dollar allocations from Congress every year that then they award to museums and libraries across the state. So this particular form was a form that they required us to use. It's a 3-year grant, and the maximum amount of money you could get from this grant was $150,000. So looking at this grant, you see section 1 is salaries and wages. And in this particular case, because we had to have a rather large match amount, we asked them to pay for a project manager for this grant, and the museum contributed all of the rest of the staff time as cost share. So that was match. So these folks were going to be at the museum, whether we got this grant or not. So we felt it made sense to allocate cost share and just ask for the dollars for the project manager. Looking down, you can see the fringe benefits column. This was payroll, taxes, and health insurance. And we asked for the grant to pay for the project managers cash in grant funds. And then we cost shared the benefits for the remaining staff. Oh, okay. Well, Isabel tells me she can't see the document I'm sharing. Isabel, can you see it now? Hopefully she can see it. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So everyone, I apologize for that. We are now, hopefully you're seeing the budget form. And again, I'll just point out that the only grant funding they were asking for was for the project manager. They were using the cost share, the salary time denoted for the grant from the executive director and the rest of the staff as a way to reach their match. So it's a small organization. They don't have a large budget. The only way they could get the match dollars accumulated was by using staff time, which they were already paying for anyway, so it made sense. Again, for each of these staff, they had to document the hours that they were working at their regular job and the hours that they were working on this project. So their time cards had to contain the project hours so that the accountant could monitor that they were actually spending the amount of time they needed to on the grant project. Looking at the second part of the budget form, we see the travel, and these dollars are listed. The grant required you to send somebody to a convening they conducted annually out of state. And so they asked you to take $2,000 in your grant budget to cover the cost of this trip. So in this particular grant, we had $2,000 that the executive director traveled to the event. We wanted to send the project director also, so we covered the cost, the museum covered the cost of the $2,416. And then they also attended in year 3, so we charged the grant for that. You can see that they've included mileage, hotel, a field trip bus, field trip hotel and food, and museum admissions. The partner museums were donating those museum admissions, so we were able to count that as cost share in year 2 when the bus trip happened. Supplies, materials, and equipment, you can get an idea of what they asked for in the grant. There's no dollar amounts in some of these because this is a revised grant. We initially asked for that, found out we didn't need it, so did not include those costs. But possible things you could charge: cell phone services, computers, monitor and services, purchase of a computer, printing, software that they bought for it, and other grant supplies. Contracts and subawards. In this particular grant, they were providing a sign for each of the partner museums that said Kansas African American. And they were also providing some sub-grants that were for them to do an event marketing and announcing the History Museum. So that could have been music, it could have been an exhibit. There were lots of options, but we wanted to give them some funds that they could actually do that. So that's why you see trail signage and faculty consulting that was donated, and speaker honorariums. Those were the funds that we gave to other museums for their event. Finally, you see the total direct costs. They summed up the grant funds requested for each year and the cost share provided for each year in the total direct costs. And then you were allowed to do this 10% of those total direct costs. So that's where we got this screen, which you've seen earlier in the presentation, and that was where the cost share came from. And the end of the grant, you had total direct and indirect costs, and then you had total costs for each year. And you can see that in this particular grant, they asked for $134,000, I'm sorry, I'll get that right, $470. That was the grant funds they requested. They had a cost share of $144,945 for a total project cost of $279,415. So the cost share has to equal the grant funds, and it can be more than the grant funds, but it can't be less. So if it's a 1-to-1 cost share, then you have to have at least $134,470 in cost share or match dollars. And we've discussed a variety of ways you can achieve that. That concludes this presentation. Thank you so much for joining me. Our next presentation will be on how to build a logic model that will serve as an outline for when you write your grant narrative. Thank you again.